Good morning. Wow, it's early. Okay, we're going to talk about Angular 2 this morning. My name's Deborah Kurata. I'm a software developer. I'm also on Google's Angular 2 documentation team. So we're looking for feedback on our documentation. How many of you have seen Angular.io? Couple of people? Okay. Angular.io is where all the Angular 2 docs are. And so for those of you who've seen it, if you have some feedback, I'd love to take it back to the team. I'm going to actually be here all day today and pretty much all day tomorrow. So if you see me in the hall or whatever, I would really enjoy getting feedback from you. I'm also a Pluralsight author. I did a course on Angular 2 called Angular 2 Getting Started, which is a much expanded version of what you're going to see here today, where I have more time so I can really cover what an observable is and how you use them. In this session, we're going to have like 3 sentences on that. I've also done a bunch of C# kind of best practices sort of courses. Okay, if you want the sample code for this session or my session this afternoon, they're on my GitHub. So you can go to that repo and pull it down. It's VS Live 2016-TX for the great state of Texas. So enough about me. How about you all? How many of you have tried out Angular 2? Okay, how many of you are coding in Angular 1? Quite a few, good. Okay, how many of you are completely new to Angular, never tried it before? Oh, wow, okay, excellent. Well, this course is a beginner level course, so if you've been spending a lot of time in Angular 2, there might not be too much new here for you, but for all of the rest of you, this looks like you're in the right place. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about, and we're going to start with why is there even an Angular 2 out there? Since we had such a Angular 1 that was quite popular, why do we even need an Angular 2? Well, one of the reasons is performance. They spent a tremendous amount of time, and they're still working on improving the performance. They're looking at really drastically reducing the footprint required to bring down like a Hello World style application. And then they're also looking at improving the performance both of the display, the rendering process, and everything else that they can do, the change detection and so on, really improving the speed. And they have some pretty impressive looking graphs showing how much faster that they've gotten with Angular 2. Angular 2 is also modern. They started building Angular 1, I think it was like in 2009. So the web has changed quite a bit since then. They've made it a lot smarter. There is one seat here up front if someone's looking for a seat, and another one here. There's one right there and one right there. So right here in the front, I don't think anyone's there. And behind, right in the row right behind there. So modern. So it takes advantage of many more. If there's a seat next to you, maybe you can raise your hand. I think there's a couple more people looking for seats. Thank you. So it takes advantage of things like packagers. So it's going to use the System.js package manager. It takes advantage of things like I mentioned, observables. It takes advantage of the newest version of ECMAScript 2015, and so on. So it's really taking advantage of a lot of the modern features. It also has a simplified API. So if you were doing Angular 1 and it was like, okay, I want to create a service. Do I want a service, or do I want a value service, or a constant service, or a factory service, or a provider service? Forgot them for a moment. It's really early. So there were so many you can't even hardly remember them all. So in Angular 2, there is a service. So it really simplified things. And again, if you were an Angular 1 developer, they dropped 46 of the the directives that you used to have memorized. So it really simplified things. And they also work to enhance our productivity, and we'll see that actually as we start to look at some demos. So for languages, you can build an Angular 2 app using ECMAScript 5. So ECMAScript is the version of JavaScript. ECMAScript 5 is probably what you're using now for your web apps. It's the one that just currently runs in any browser. If you type a script tag in some script, that's ECMAScript 5. There's no compile required. It just runs in your browser. ES 2015, previously known as ES 6, came out like in July, I think, of last year. Not all of the browsers support it yet, but it has a lot of new features like classes, let statements, arrow syntax, which is like our Lambda expressions. So all of that has come out recently, but as I said, not all browsers can recognize that. So what we all have to do is we have to do something called transpilation, which basically means they take our ES 2015 code and they transpile it into ES5 code that the browser can understand for us, so that we as developers can take advantage of all these new features, but the browser still can get something that it understands. Another choice is TypeScript. How many of you have at least heard of TypeScript? Excellent. Okay, so for the couple of you who might not have, it's a product from Microsoft. It is a superset of JavaScript, so it's basically all of ES 2015 plus strong typing. And as C# and VB.NET developers, we understand the advantages of strong typing, including much better tooling experience in the IDE. And lastly, there's a language called Dart, and as far as I know, no one but Google uses that. The one that we've that I've asterisked up there is TypeScript, because that is the one that's really recommended. If you go to the Angular 2 docs, the vast majority of the docs are in TypeScript. If you go to Stack Overflow, the majority of all of the tips in there, the suggestions, the help is all in TypeScript. I was just at ngConf 2 weeks ago, which is the big Angular conference. All the speakers, even on their little Macs, were all running TypeScript. TypeScript is cross-platform, so if you have some folks back at the office that are using Apple products or love Linux, TypeScript works on any of those platforms because it is just a superset of JavaScript. Okay, so what is an Angular 2 application? An Angular 2 application is just comprised of a set of components. So we just build a component, build another component, build another component, and then we also still have services that have cross-cutting concern kind of things. So anytime we want to do like a logging component or data access component or anything like that, we actually wouldn't build it as a component, we'd build it as a service. We also can use services as a singleton so that we can use it to share data. So if we want to retrieve user preference kind of data, we can build it as part of a service, and then any of our components can get access to it. So the next obvious question is, what's a component, right? So what's a component? A component is comprised of a template, and a template is basically an HTML fragment. So it's the actual visual part that you're going to show in the browser, plus a class. Okay, so we're going to have a class that is kind of our code behind. So if you're familiar with web forms or Windows forms or any of those kind of technologies, we're very familiar with the concept of a code behind kind of file. If you're familiar with MVVM, model view, view model, you can think of this as your view model. So it's the code that helps the template. It provides the data to the template. It provides the interactions for the template. So that's in our class. Lastly, a component has some metadata, and the metadata gives some additional information to Angular on what to do with the component, how to set it up, how to work with it, and we'll see what that all looks like. Now, one of the huge advantages that we all have as .NET developers over folks who are just ES5 developers is that all of this is going to look very, very familiar. Because what do we do all day? We create classes, right? We create properties, we create methods. We're very familiar with that. So I believe that .NET developers are going to have a much easier time with Angular 2 than some of the ES5 developers who haven't really worked with classes and objects quite as much. Okay, so with that, we're going to do a real quick demo of the application we're going to be working with. And it is here. All right. So the sample is called a movie hunter. It's going to help us hunt down which movie we want to watch, whatever. So this is our welcome page. So it welcomes you to the application. And I can click on the movie list option and see my list of movies. And I think I can up that even a little bit more. Is that easier to see? So what can I do here? I can click this button to hide and show the movie poster if I happen to have one for a movie. I can filter. So here's my filter. As soon as I type something in here like rings, I see that it's showing me movies filtered by, and it's filtering my list of movies. So I can specify something specific here or whatever that I want to filter. You notice also that it's formatting all of my data nicely. I've got a nicely formatted date. I've got a nicely formatted rating, dollar, percent. And then here I've got a star rating. So here I have a component that I'm using that is converting the rating 1 through 5 into actual stars. And we also have another page. So if I click on these, we go to the detail page. And it's also using that same little component that knows how to display stars. Okay, so that's the sample app that we're going to be looking at. However, we're not going to just dive right into the finished one because that would be way too much code to start with. We're going to start one step at a time. And of course, since it's Movie Hunter, I have take 1, take 2, get it? Anyway, okay, so we're going to start at the very beginning and look at a simpler one to start off with. But first, we're going to look at a few more slides so that we know what we're looking at when we look at the code. All right, so we just saw the application, the sample application, and I just said that, hey, an Angular application is made of components. So our first thought is, all right, how would we build this application with components? First thing that we probably want is a welcome component for that welcome screen. And remember I said a component has a template and a class and metadata. So the template for the welcome component would have the HTML for that welcome page. That makes sense, yeah? Yeah, said the crowd, because we're all awake this morning. All right. We probably also want a movie list component, right? That displays that movie list page, and it's going to have its HTML, and we're going to have that view model kind of class behind it that's going to know how to provide the movie data. We also, in there, want to use a star component. That's the little component that knows how to convert a number into a nice, pretty star rating. And we want that to be a separate component so we can reuse it. We also want a movie detail component that is going to also reuse that star component. So those are the components that we're going to build here. Now, Angular also wants a single point of entry into all of this, something that pulls this whole thing together. We call that the app component. Now, you don't have to call it the app component, but anywhere you look, people are calling it the app component by convention. Okay, you could call it Joe's component, whatever. But you'll see it called app component, and it's the primary component for the application. And it knows how to route or display each of these other different components. And then, of course, we need a movie data service that's going to provide the movie data. And so we're going to see how to build a service. And lastly, we need that ubiquitous index.html, which, as you know, when you hit the website, that's usually the first file that comes down, and that's how we're going to host our application. Okay, so are we good with what we're building? All right, so what does a component look like in code? That's what it looks like. You might look at it and go, gosh, that looks really weird. But if we break it down, we will see that it looks very, very similar to our C# and VB.NET code. So let's start at the bottom, because that's going to look the most familiar. So it says export class app component. So that's not that much different than any of the classes we create, though we usually say public class app component. So we use export to export this class, and make this available to any part of the application. In the class, then, I can define any properties and methods that I want. Here, I only have a single property. And you'll notice that this is actually all TypeScript syntax. So what we're looking at here is TypeScript code. In TypeScript, the data type is defined with a colon and the type. So in C# we would say string, space, page title. Here we're saying page title, colon, string. So this is actually a little bit closer to VB.NET, which would be page title as string. But you get the idea. It's not that different from what we're used to. And here we set it equal to some constant that we want to display. So that looks familiar, yeah? Yes, okay. So what is this other thing up here? The @ up here is representing a decorator, and it's @ component, so it's called a component decorator. Well, that looks really odd. Well, when you think about it, no, it doesn't. We have the same thing in VB and C#. Anybody want to guess what that is? It looks like this or like this, depending upon your language. You set it on top of a class. Attributes, thank you. Yes, attributes. The other thing you were saying is the next part up there. All right, so attributes. So we've got attributes, right? If you've done any testing, you attribute your test class and your test method. Or if you've done Entity Framework, you attribute your validation. We know what we're talking about? Okay, so that's really all this is. It's an attribute that's sitting on top of our class. So we're attributing it, and we're providing some additional information about this class to Angular. And so that's where we both define our metadata and our template inside there. So this first thing, backing up just a moment. So just like with attributes, what this really is a function call. So when you create an attribute, it's basically calling into some code. And that's what this is doing too. It's calling into a function and passing in an object. That's what the curly braces are inside there. And the object has properties and values. So the first property is selector. So that value is the name of this component when we're going to reference it in the HTML. So if you're familiar with Angular 1 and custom directives, we're basically defining a custom directive. For those of you not familiar with Angular 1, what we're building basically is a custom HTML tag. So we're going to have an HTML tag called mh-app. Now, how did I get that name? The recommendation is to use some kind of abbreviation appropriate for your app. So I used MH for Movie Hunter, and then -app, because this is our app component. Okay, makes sense? So you wouldn't use MH probably, you would use whatever would be appropriate for your application. So that is how we use this component in the HTML from another component. All right, the template, as you would expect, is where we're going to put our HTML. So here is the HTML. Now, if you've worked with Angular 1 before, you recognize the double curly brace syntax. If you haven't, what that is data binding. So it's binding to the page title property of the class. And again, as .NET developers, most of us are very familiar with data binding, either through XAML or through web forms or Windows forms or Silverlight. So we're used to data binding, and that's what's happening here. It's a binding to that page title. Okay, and this last part, what does this look like to you from a C# perspective? Using. So what we're telling this we're telling Angular is, where is component? I'm using the @component decorator. Where can you find that component? So that line is really no different than using system.component model or using system.data or using system. Whatever, link. So it's very, very similar to that, but instead of system.something, it's @Angular/something, okay? So this looks, again, when you actually break it out, it is very similar to what we're used to. The other nice thing about Angular 2 from Angular 1 is that everything we build in Angular 2 is going to look like this. We've got a class, we've got a decorator, we import what we need. Okay, and if you've ever created a directive in Angular 1 and you have this whole other syntax you have to learn, none of that, you don't have to do any of that anymore. In Angular 2, it's all components. Class, decorator, import what we need. Okay. Angular 2 is modular, so you can think of Angular 2 being set up just like our system is. Again, system.component model, and so on. We've got Angular core, animate, HTTP, router, and so on. So again, it's very conceptually similar. So how do we host our application? What I did here, this is our app component, and the naming convention is to start with the actual name of the component, so we called ours app, and then .component, and then .ts, because it's TypeScript. John Papa, if you've heard of him, he did a really nice style guide for Angular 1 and is well known for that. He is currently leading the effort to build the style guide for Angular 2. The style guide as it is right now is part of the Angular 2 documentation, because he's also on the Angular 2 documentation team for Google. And so we are all putting his style guide in as part of the Angular I/O website. So if you're interested in the style guide, like for naming, for your layout of your directories or your folders, whatever, for naming conventions and all of that, he has that style guide started. It's not, of course, finished at this point, but it is ongoing, and he's got quite a lot of good information on there. Okay, so that's our component. How do we actually use that? Well, in our index.html, again, our index.html is the first one that comes down and gets executed by the browser. We're actually going to use this component using its selector. Okay, so that's how we bring in this component into our HTML. So we specified our selector of mhapp, so that's our custom HTML tag. So what will happen when the index.html file comes down and loads, it's going to display on the screen to the user, loading app, ... And as the application loads and this app component loads, it then matches up the mhapp on the left with the mhapp on the right, and it displays that template there in between the tags. So it'll replace the loading app with in-step movie hunter, because that's the data binding for the page title, and my first component. Okay, do we see how that's kind of connecting together? All right. So let's look at this first, then simple first step. Movie hunter, take one. All right. So the other thing that you will find is that a lot of people use VS Code. How many of you have used or at least know about VS Code? Quite a few. Okay, so VS Code is also a Microsoft product. The biggest difference from VS Code from Visual Studio is that it is cross-platform. So this also can be used by folks with Apple machines and also Linux. This also has really become the de facto editor. Again, at ngConf 2 weeks ago, a huge number of the developers, the presenters were using VS Code. The Angular team uses VS Code. So you'll really see a lot of examples done this way. All right, I can ump that font a little bit more. Can you guys see it in the back okay, or should I take it up one more? It's good? Okay, great. All right, so this should look exactly like what we just saw on the slide, right? So this really is all the code that you need. So this is all the exact same thing that we saw on the slide. Our index.html then, if we go down to the bottom, this is also exactly what we saw on the slide. I also want to talk a little bit more about what else is going on here. So this is all the code that you will ever pretty much need in your index.html file to get Angular 2 to go. Now, if you bring in third-party libraries or stuff, you might need to add things here. But if you were coding in Angular 1, every single time you added anything to the project, you had to add a script for it here. You no longer need to ever do that. Okay, so that's really sweet because that was frequently something I would forget to do, and then I couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. Okay, so what is here? Well, of course, we start with our style sheets with those link statements, so you can still link in style sheets just like before. Then we've got a couple of scripts that are required for Angular to run. It's something called a shim, which helps it convert correctly to ES5 to run in the older browsers, Zone Reflect, and System.js. So System.js is a module loader. And so it's loading these files for us, and that's why we don't need to manually put our scripts in here. So what that other little piece of script is doing is it's saying load the System.js config file, and then it is importing everything from the app folder. So as long as you put all of your pieces parts for your app under the app folder, it is going to be automatically imported and pulled into the app as it's needed. Okay? So I'm not expecting you to memorize all of this at this point, but just know that you don't have to keep modifying this. We will not touch this file then for the rest of this session because we don't ever need to change it to make our app work. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And with any luck, when it comes up, it should say loading app, and then it will replace the content with our, let's see, I can't type and talk at the same time. Replace the content with our template. Come on, baby. There it goes. Okay, so loading app, there it is. Okay, so pretty exciting first component, yeah? Okay, but we got it to work, and everything is copacetic and good, so that's that. And I'm just going to close down some of this, because we're going to go on to take 2. Cannot see the bottom of my window, so I keep guessing what I'm typing, and it's not what I'm thinking. There it goes. All right, so picking back up. All right, so part of what a component includes is that template. Now, when we think about that, that movie list page, there's quite a bit of HTML that's probably required to display all of that, right? We don't really want to type all of that in here in a string because then we don't get the benefits of our IDE, right? We don't get end tag completion, we don't get IntelliSense, we don't get syntax checking. So we frequently don't want to necessarily put our template directly in here. So what are our options for defining a template? Well, one option is to just use simple HTML in a quoted string, either with a single quote or double quote, and to use the template property. Another option is to use the template property, like we did in our example, with a backtick. In ES 2015, backticks define a template literal, which allows you then to have carriage returns in there, unlike a regular HTML kind of string. So that lets me put carriage returns and to lay that out a little nicer. So that is a little bit nicer than going off to the right. But the third option that you frequently want to do for any page of any size is you want to use template URL instead of template and specify a URL to an HTML fragment that defines what the page should look like. Okay, so that's what we're going to do for our movie list. Also notice the naming convention here. So I'm going to be calling my movie list component movie-list.component.ts. So the template is movie-list.component.html. So it keeps the two of them visually together so that you can very easily find both of them. And again, that's in John's style guide. All right, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is data binding. One of the real benefits of Angular is its very powerful data binding that really reduces how much code that you need to write. So what these things represent here is on the right is our component that we've written, our code behind class, and on the left is the DOM, the document object model. If you're not familiar with the DOM, it's basically the data structure that sits behind the browser. So it's what the browser understands is what the browser is going to display. So one way to do data binding in Angular is one-way binding from the component to the DOM using interpolation, which is the double curly brace syntax. And we saw that with our page title. Another option, which is also a one-way binding, is something called property binding. And property binding is defined with square braces, square brackets, whatever. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting the src property of the image tag. So by having property binding and being able to bind to any property that we want, we can completely control the DOM from our component. Again, but this is only one way. This is why we don't need 46 extra directives, because we can now bind to anything we want. We don't have to wait for Angular to come up and define a directive for it for us. All right, we often also need to get information back from the DOM, and that's also one-way binding, but it's from the DOM to our component. And so that's done with event binding with parentheses. So here I'm binding to the click event. This is another reason why we don't need so many directives, because Angular doesn't have to define for us a directive for each kind of event. We can then bind to any event. We can bind to events we create in our own components just by simply putting it in parentheses. What it will do then is it will recognize the click event and call the toggle image method in our component. Okay. The last thing it has is two-way binding. Now the syntax for that looks a little odd at first. I hated it when I first saw it, but it's kind of grown on me. And what this is doing is it's doing both property binding, so it has the parentheses, so it's going one way from the DOM to the component, and it's also doing property binding, which are the square braces. In order to remember the order of that, it's sometimes referred to as a banana in a box, because it's the parens inside the square brackets. And that's the two-way binding. So if we edit the value in the component of the list filter property, the DOM will automatically recognize it. If the user changes that value, like it's tied to an input box, like in that example, then the component will get the changes. Okay, so very extensive binding capabilities in Angular 2. We can also transform data, because sometimes the data that we get back from the server isn't exactly how we want it. So we can transform data with pipes. And again, those familiar with Angular 1, this is a replacement for filters. So you can transform any bound properties before you actually display them. There are a bunch of built-in pipes. You can format a date. You can format to lowercase, uppercase, number, decimal, percent, currency, and so on. So there's a lot of different built-in pipes, and what they look like is actually the pipe character, hence the name. So I'm here using interpolation binding. I'm binding to the MPAA rating, the Motion Picture of America Association, or whatever that stands for. And I'm ensuring it's uppercase, because when you're used to seeing PG-13, you're used to seeing it with a capital P and a capital G. So that is the pipe. You can also write your own custom pipes, and I have an example of one we'll see in the last demo of this session. Now, I said that we create our own custom directives by using the selector. So we can define these by simply creating a component and giving it a selector. But Angular still does have some of its own built-in directives. So we're going to look at a couple in this session. We're going to look at a couple more in this afternoon's session when I'm talking about Angular 2 forms and validation. But the two directives I want to talk about here are called structural directives, and that's because they affect the structure of the DOM, the document object model. The first one is ngIf. All of the structural directives are identified with an asterisk in front of it, and that is so that the tooling can recognize it as a structural directive. The ngIf is saying to the DOM, include this table element and all of its children if that expression is true. If that expression is not true, then completely remove that DOM element and all of its children from the DOM. So if you actually look at your document object model, it will not be there. The other one is ng4, and if you are familiar with Angular 1, this is the replacement for ngRepeat. Again, it has an asterisk, and the syntax here is let movie of movies, which is very similar to our for each kind of thing. But this is using the ECMAScript 2016 for of syntax. So if you've spent any time with ES 2016 yet, it basically matches that syntax. That's why it's of instead of in. What this does is it repeats this TR tag and all of its children for each movie in an array of movies. Okay, so this would be an easy way to display all of the movies in the form, or in the movie list. It's not a form. All right. Styling. As I talked about a few moments ago when we were looking at the index.html, you can still style using the link tag, just like we always have styled a web application. But with Angular 2, we also have a second choice. Here we're looking at our component decorator. Here we had a selector and a template URL. What I'm showing you here then is the style URLs. And it's plural because you can have multiple styles. You can only have one template associated with a component, but it can have multiple styles. Why would you want to do that? Because you can specifically style one component, and it will not leak into any of the other components. So say in your component you had a table and you wanted to style it. Instead of having to define a style class, you could just style table, and you wouldn't have to be worried about it affecting any other table in the whole rest of the application. So if you've ever had that happen where somebody changed a style and it impacted places that you weren't expecting, you can do this instead where you're associating the style with the component. You still can have global styles, but this also lets you have styles that are unique to a component. Making sense? Okay. So how do we use a component? There are actually two different ways that we can use a component, and you need to sort of decide how you're going to use it as you're building it or before you build it, because how you build it is going to be a little different depending upon how you're going to use it. There are two basic ways that you're going to use a component. The first is as a directive, and that's what we've seen so far. Our app component, we used it as a directive to host our application by using that mhapp as a tag in our HTML. We also want to do that same technique if we're going to have a nested component. And so that would be something like our star rating. We're going to nest that in other components. You would never just display a whole page that was just these 5 little stars, or probably never. You're going to embed that in another component. And so that is one way to use a component as a directive. The other way to use a component is as something called a routing target, which basically means you plan to display it as a full page style view. Okay, so that would be what we would do for our movie list component and our movie detail component and our welcome component. So we would set them up as a routing target because we most likely wouldn't really put this inside, another component. All right, so how does this affect how we build the component? Well, if you're building it as a directive, you have to have that selector because that defines what that directive is, and then that selector is used as a custom directive. So that was the example that we saw. For our star rating, it would look something like this. So we would have a table data area, and we would have our star rating. Now, I named that IS-star because I want this to be a reusable component across the company. And the company used in this app is InStep, so IS for InStep. Instead of MH, because it's not specific to this application, I'm going to reuse this across many applications. So does that make sense? All right. If we're going to define a component as a routing target, we do not need that selector. Okay, so the only purpose of that selector is to give it a name for our HTML. If we're not going to use it as a custom HTML tag, we don't need a selector on it. We instead have to define a route for it. Okay, so right now the routes look like this. If you have been following Angular 2 at all, you know that they had routes developed one way. Immediately before ngconf, they changed the routing completely. And after a couple of us have worked with it a while, they've decided to redo it yet again. So conceptually, it will be the same, but the syntax might be different. But right now, the syntax looks like this. So you notice the add on that. So it's a decorator. We're going to decorate that on a class. And we're going to say these are what our routes are. So we define a path, and that's what's going to be in our address bar. And we specify the component name of the component we want to load. So our path for our movie list might just be /movies, and we want to load the movie list component. Okay, so that's how we're going to route to these things. So this brings up another term that I wanted to cover called a SPA, or single page application. Just checking my notes, making sure I don't miss anything. All right, so single page application. As we saw, our index.html hosts our application by having that main app tag in there. So it contains the main page for the application. This is often the only web page of the entire application. Wait, what? Didn't we just see that we have a welcome page and a movie list page and a detail page? How can our index.html be our only web page? If you think of a web page technically as having the HTML, head, body, we only ever have one of those. All of our little HTML files are HTML fragments. Okay, they won't have a head, body, they just usually start with a div or something similar. Yeah? The question has to do with indexing all of these pages for search purposes. And one of the things that the team is currently still working on, and they're planning to finish that before it's fully released, is server-side compiling of your templates so that it would be completely searchable. But right now, that is not there. But it will be before it's released. So it won't be via what we're writing today. But there will be a back-end compilation process for that. Because they are thinking of that, because that was one of the big complaints about Angular 1, is it was really hard to get that thing indexed. Okay, so back to this. So all of our little pieces are just fragments. So hence an Angular application is often called a single page application because it's just that index.html, and everything else is inserted into that. So you can think of the index.html as having this DOM, this document object model data structure behind it. And all we're doing is changing that DOM. and changing it more and adding things and removing things, and it's all still index.html. Okay, so how does routing work then? Well, normally, if I had something like this with a menu, which is kind of like what you saw in that very first demo, what we're going to do is associated with that link, and that happens to be an anchor tag type of link, I define a router link using a Angular directive. So this is one of the built-in directives for routing. And what I do is I tell it which path is associated with that menu option. The other thing is I add a router outlet, which is another Angular 2 routing directive. And I put that where I want it to inject in my HTML for my template. Okay, so what Angular does is it says, okay, I understand that if the user clicks on that, that I'm going to do the movies path. So it looks up the movies path and it says, oh, okay, I want the movie list component. It modifies the address bar. The URL now says /movies. It finds and loads that component, and it displays the contents of it where that router outlet was. When you go to the next page, it removes this from the router outlet and puts the other page inside that router outlet. So it just keeps removing and adding things to the DOM. Making sense? Okay, excellent. All right, so this is our sample application architecture that we've built so far. We've got our index.html, we've got our app component. What we want to build now is our movie list component. So let's take a look at that. All right, so our index.html basically looks the same as it did. And here is our movie list component. So again, we've got an export class, and actually I want to look at the HTML first. Let's do that. That'll make more sense. All right, so if you recall from our first demo, we had a movie list component that brought up our list of movies. So here in our example, we're going to use one-way binding using interpolation to display our page title. And again, can you guys back there see this okay? Okay. And then here is our filter by. Remember I had that input box that the user could type in and filter our list. So this is an input box, and we're using two-way binding against something called list filter. So far we know that our code behind has to define a property called page title, and it has to define a property called list filter. Here we're using our ngIf directive, because we're only displaying this movies filtered by if the user had typed something in for the filtering. So again, we're using that same list filter property here. Then here is another property that we're going to want, our error message, and this only displays if we have an error message, otherwise it doesn't display it. So we're again using ngIf. Here is our table that has our list of movies, and again we're using ngIf. So we don't display the table if there is no movies property or if that movies array doesn't have a length. So here we need a movies property, so that's something else. If someone's keeping track of all of these different things that we're going to need when we go to our component. All right, then we had a button to hide and show our movie poster, and that's this code right here. And so here I'm using the click event handler and calling toggle image. And then I'm using a show image property, so that's another property I need, and now I also need a toggle image method. And it's going to then hide or show this movie poster. This part are all the headers for our table rows. And then here are our table rows. So here's our ng4 syntax, let movie of movies. Here is our pipe, because we're going to filter the movies based on that list filters variable that is associated with what the user typed in. Movie filter here is a custom filter that I had to write to filter my movies. In Angular 1, there was a filter that could filter things for you. Pipes They did not provide a filter type of pipe. So if you need to filter, you need to write it yourself. And we'll look at that in the last demo. I'm going to just ignore it for the moment. Okay, so here then we have another ngIf by our image, because we only want that image to show if this show image property is set and the movie has an image. And all of this additional brace syntax here, or square bracket syntax, are some additional property bindings. So I'm actually binding to the style.width.px. So I can actually specify the units here as part of the property binding. Here I'm binding to the source of the image, and here the title. Okay. Down here then, I'm using interpolation, because all this is read-only, so I can use the one-way binding. I'm binding to the title, director, the release date. Now, in order to format this date as a date, it actually has to be a date and not a string. Now, when it comes in from the server, it's coming in as a string. So I'm converting it to a date and then formatting it nicely as a date. And I could format this date to anything I want, YYMMDD, however I wanted the date set up. I am using the pipe for the uppercase, currency. Here I'm just doing the star rating as a number, because we haven't added our star component yet. We will do that a little later, and here we're doing a % for our approval rating. Okay, so what does our class then look like? So here is our component decorator. So our template URL goes to that HTML that we just looked at. Here we have a special style sheet just for that. And here I'm telling it that I might want to use this custom movie filter pipe. And then we have imports for all of those things. One of the other things that TypeScript gives us that JavaScript does not have, not even ES 2015, are interfaces. So we can actually define interfaces in our TypeScript. And that, again, is going to be a concept very foreign to ES5 developers, but very, very familiar to us as .NET developers. So I've created an interface for my movie. And again, because everything's strongly typed, I get tooling, so I could just go to definition. And here's the definition for my interface. And again, it's using the TypeScript style types. So approval rating is a number, director as a string, and so on. And again, the date coming in here is coming in the release date as a string. So it's defined as a string there. So that's what this is pulling in. It's pulling in the definition of what a movie looks like. Okay, so looking now at our class, we've got our page title. We've got the list filter that we're using for the two-way binding. It's initially going to start as empty. Here's the show image. That's defining whether or not we're showing the image. Here's our list of movies, which right now is hard-coded in here, and our error message. Here we have a constructor, and again, as .NET developers, we're familiar with constructors, where we're calling that getMovie. And here is our toggle image method, which is just simply changing the value of this property. And here is that convert to date that's taking our string date and creating a new JavaScript style date from it. Okay? So our only purpose of this component is to provide the support for our HTML. Okay? All right, so we have hard-coded data in here, and that's because we haven't yet built our data service. But we'll do that next. All right, so the other thing we want to look at is our app component. So we've modified our app component a little bit. Remember that it was just this little part. And now, in addition to our component decorator, I also have the route defined on my app component. And I also changed my template here. So instead of saying my first component or whatever it said, that's my router outlet. So as it's routing to all of these other places, it's right there in the HTML that it's going to stick all of the other pages that I'm routing to. Okay, can you kind of picture that? All right. And so then this is my path. So I'm defining a default path, So when the system first comes up, it's going to display my movie list component. That's because in this take 2, I only have the one component. As I add more, we'll see how that changes. Okay, are we good with step 2, take 2? Certainly. Much better? Mm-hmm. Okay. So are we good on that other than that? Okay. So moving on. So now this is what we have. But what we need next is our movie data service, because right now, as you saw, we just have our movies hard-coded in, and we wouldn't want to write an app like that. So we want to have a service that's going to provide our list of movies for us. Our first cut of the movie service, though, it doesn't yet have a back end for us, so we're going to still hard-code the movies in. In the very last demo that we'll see in this session, we'll add the HTTP part to it. But right now I want to focus just on the part of creating the service, and in the last demo we'll look at how to actually hook that up to an HTTP call. All right, so services. Services provide functionality across components. So some examples are logging, if you have some calculations that you want to use across your components. Data access, data sharing, like the example I mentioned earlier with creating user or retrieving user preference information and wanting to have access to that across all of your components. The way that services work in Angular is it uses dependency injection. And if you're not familiar at all with dependency injection, Jeremy is doing a really good talk tomorrow on dependency injection. You might want to check that out. But basically, the idea with dependency injection is that something else, somewhere else, is going to actually create the instance of this for you. In .NET, you usually do it with some kind of container. In Angular, it provides that for you, and it's something called the Angular injector. So what we do is we register our service with the Angular injector, and then we just tell the injector where we want that service injected in. So we would just say, okay, I'm creating a movie service, injector, I want you to know about this service, and then any place we need it, like in our movie list component, the movie list component says, I need it, so give me an instance of it. And that instance then can be a singleton, meaning that it's one instance that all of them are sharing. So if you set data in there, if you set x equals to 5 from one component, the other component also sees x as 5. So it'll share that data across. Okay, so this is a shorter version of the movie list component that we just saw. I don't have all the code in there so that it fit nicely on the slide. But just so that you kind of remember what a component looks like, this is what a service looks like. Notice how similar it is. We still have our export class. My movie service has one method called getMovies. It'll probably have another method called getMovie for the detail and for the edit feature. And maybe I might have a save movie and so on, but we'll start with one, getMovies. Notice that it has also a decorator. Its decorator is at injectable instead of at component, because we don't want it to be a component. We want it to be an injectable service. And of course, we have our import, because we have to tell Angular where to find injectable, and that's also part of Angular core. Okay, so again, everything we're building in .NET, sure, that too. Everything we're building in Angular, class, decorator, import what we need. Okay, very consistent, and that's what's really helping productivity. All right, so how do we use this service from our component? Well, the first thing that we need to do is specify it as a provider, and that is what's registering it with the injector. So as soon as I do that, I'm saying, hey, injector, here is a service that's available to be injected. It comes back and says, I have no idea what movie service is. What am I missing? Imports, yes, or import, singular. Import, I'm missing that import, okay, and telling it where it is. The last thing that I need to do then is actually inject it in. And this again is TypeScript. So the TypeScript syntax for injecting in a service is to inject it into the constructor. So it will automatically give you that instance from the injector, and then you can just simply use it. Now that syntax might look a little odd. Why do we have that private keyword in there? And that could be public or protected. But why is that in there? I've never seen a keyword like that, an accessor keyword inside a parameter like that. And what that is it's actually a shortcut. Okay, we know that the C# team and VB.NET team have frequently given us all sorts of shortcuts, like those auto-implemented properties, right? Those are just simply little shortcuts. So what this is it's actually a shortcut for this. The pattern was so common that you have to declare some variable to hold your service, inject your service into another variable, and set the service variable equal to your local variable. So instead of making you retype that similar code every time you want to inject in a service, by taking the accessor and sticking it in there, it's treating that as a shortcut. So is that making sense? Okay, and you will see that syntax pretty much everywhere, but not necessarily private. It could be a public. All that's defining is the scope of your local variable. Okay. The last thing then I want to talk about before we go into another demo is the component life cycle. Now, a component has a life cycle. When Angular first needs to load it, it creates the instance of the component, it renders its template, it creates and renders its children, then it processes changes. So it sits there for however that long that form is displayed and processes any changes. The user clicks on a button, it changes something. Our code gets data back from a server, it changes something. So it's watching for changes. Now, as soon as we no longer need the component, then it goes into the destroy. We can access several points in this life cycle to be able to react to things. Okay? Excuse me. So we do that using something called a life cycle hook. Okay? And this is, again, where we're going to have an easier time than straight JavaScript folks, because the life cycle hooks are provided as interfaces. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm implementing onInit. Okay, so that is implementing the onInit lifecycle hook. Right now, each of the lifecycle hooks require that you implement one method. So they have one method in their interface. And that method, I've got the steps. So you implement onInit, and then of course you need the imports for it. And then here is the method, ng-onInit. So the convention is that if the interface is onInit, that the method name is ng-onInit. And that is the method that you implement. We're all familiar with interfaces, yeah? Yes, roared the crowd. Okay, so all I'm doing is console.log here, but you can imagine that we can do other things. So what kinds of other things do we want to do here? We, as .NET developers, have learned a long time ago that we don't want to put a whole lot of stuff in our constructors, right? Our constructor should be short and quick because you should be able to get an instance. You should never really put code in a constructor that can generate an error. You really want to be able to, just maybe do a little initialization, but not much. And that's true throughout .NET. And that's also true here. We don't want to put a whole lot of code in our constructors. So then the question is, where do we go get the data for the page? Okay, so when the component is first constructed, is that when we want to go out and make an HTTP call and wait for that data to come back? No, said the crowd. Right? We don't want to have, because that's going to take a good long time. We don't want all of that in our constructor, and prone to error, oh my gosh, right? When you're hitting an HTTP service. So you don't want all of that in the constructor. So where do you put it? You put it in ng on init. Okay, any of you have ever done Windows forms? A couple people, okay? You don't put all of your initialization in the constructor, right? Where do you put it? Form load. Or init. I think it has an init too, doesn't it? It's been a while. But you never put it in the constructor. It's in the form load event. Same thing for Silverlight. We had events that came out. I think XAML also provides the same kind of thing. You have events that you go get your data on, not part of your class constructor. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to do with the ng on init. And with that, we're going to jump right into our services demo. Oh, that's the old one. Services is take 3. And I will pump that up also. I love VS Code. No hunting through menu options, trying to find how to set the font. Okay, so service. All right, so right now our service is still hard coding the data, but look at how simple it is to create. We've got our export, we've got our method, and this method will very shortly go to HTTP instead. We're importing what we need. We need injectable, and we need our movie array, our iMovie interface, so that we can define that. So that's all we had to do for our service. The hard part is getting the HTTP stuff in there, which we'll look at next. Okay, so the other piece I wanted to look at is just how we use this service. And again, just like the slides, we define it as a provider. We do our import, which is right there, and then we're injecting it into our constructor. And here we implemented on init, and it's in the ng on init that we're calling a method that in turn calls our service to go get our movies. Okay, I could have just put this code right in here, but by putting it in a separate method, I could unit test it a little bit easier. Okay, so that's services. Certainly. Well, considering I have 10 minutes left, no, we're not covering unit testing. No, I'm not covering unit testing in this at all.
The system for registering dependencies is not really changed from Angular 1.
It is, and we will be looking at that shortly. Let me show you the next demo and see if that answers what your issue is. But I want to make sure I have a chance to get to this last demo. And I'm again going to make that bigger. Okay, so really quickly. So what we have is that, what we want is that. So what we want is we want that movie data service defined outside of our movie list component. And I think this might be answering your question. So what we really want to do is inject it into our app component, or not inject it in, we want to register it with our app component, and then it can be injected into any of our other components as needed. So then we don't directly register it with either of the other components. All right, so that takes us right into our last demo here. So the first thing, so this is the final version. So this is the one that you saw at the very beginning. So this one has all of our features. And we're going to start by looking at the app component. And so now, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. I meant to do that. So the first thing that you'll notice here is that we now have a set of routes that go to all of our different components. So we've got our welcome component, our movie list component, and our movie detail component. So we have routes for all of those. And again, don't pay too much attention to the syntax because more than likely it's changing. So now we have moved our provider, because remember I said the purpose of the providers was to register the service with the injector. I have now taken it out of the movie list component, and I've moved it in here to my app component. So here is where I'm registering the movie service with the Angular injector, and then here is where I'm importing it. Notice also that my template is a little different here. I now have the actual menu with my home option, which goes to the welcome route, and my movie list, which goes to the movies route. And then here is my router outlet where those pages are actually going to be displayed. So our index.html never has to change. All it is doing is saying the app component goes here, and then the app component is handling everything else. Okay, so the other big change that I made here was to the service. So we're going to take a look at that. So here is our service. We are now using HTTP. So I'm importing HTTP in response. And here I'm also importing observable. Observable is a feature of the reactive extensions, which is also a Microsoft product, which again shows a lot of the sharing that Microsoft and Google are doing with regard to Angular 2. You can think of an observable as basically an array of async values. So it's an array where they keep getting more and more async values. And Angular 2 is using that in place of promises where you could really only get one async value. The other benefit of observables over promises is that they are cancelable. So if you've ever wanted to cancel a promise, the observables will let you do that. So here I'm injecting HTTP in. So there I'm injecting in the HTTP service that Angular is providing me. And then here is my new get movies. I'm calling this underscore HTTP. That's my private variable .get. So this is my HTTP get. Here's my URL. And then this line of code here, this map statement, what that's doing is it's mapping my results. So it's taking the response and it's automatically mapping it into an array of movies for me. Okay, so it's restructuring my result into a movie array. The rest of this is for debugging, and this is for error handling. So then on the other side, when I use this, so like in my movie list component now when I call get movies, what I'm getting back is not the data. What I'm getting back is an observable. And if I want to start getting the async values back from that observable, I need to subscribe to them. So that's why I'm calling the subscribe method. So then when I get the movies back, I can assign it to my local this movies variable, or if I get an error back, I can assign it to my error messages variable, my property. Okay, so that's how that works. All right. So let's finish up. So if you're familiar with Angular 1, moving to Angular 2 may feel somewhat like this, because there is a tremendous amount more to learn for Angular 2 than there was for Angular 1. You've got to learn about observables. You've got to learn about System.js or some kind of package manager. You've got to learn TypeScript. You've got to maybe learn a new editor like VS Code. So there's just a huge amount. You have to learn ES 2016. There's just a lot more that you have to learn. But again, the key point I wanted to make here is, as .NET developers, this is going to be a much easier step because we know so much more about interfaces and classes and properties and methods and a lot of the stuff that's now included with Angular. So how do we move from Angular 1 to Angular 2? Well, the Angular team is providing something called ng Upgrade that is going to allow you to run Angular 1 and Angular 2 side by side. So that means if you want to start building new parts of your application in Angular 2, you can do that and still have it work with your Angular 1 pieces. Or you can start taking some of your pieces of your application and migrating them one by one. You don't have to rewrite your whole app all at once. Or don't. The Angular team has committed to keeping the Angular 1 information out and available. They made the two websites different. The Angular.io site for Angular 2 is separate from the Angular 1 site. They plan to leave the Angular 1 site up until nobody's hitting it anymore. So that could be many years to come. And then just wait for that next project before you move to Angular 2. So that's what their plan is. So our takeaways: Angular is comprised of components, templates, lots of great data binding. We're going to route to our components, and we're going to build services for cross-cutting concerns. And with that, I want to thank you all very much for coming.